fireside chat today. We're lucky to have Dr. Victoria Herman, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Rise Up to Rising Tides. As a National Geographic explorer, she traveled across the country in 2016 and 2017, interviewing 350 local leaders to identify what's needed most to safeguard coastal communities against the unavoidable impacts of climate change. She's testified before the US Senate, contributes to The Guardian and Scientific American on climate policy, and was named one of the top most 100 influential people in climate policy worldwide in 2019 by Apolitical. We also have, oh, my little thing's not working. Working with her today, we also have Anna Morandi, who is at the National League of Cities. She oversees the Leadership and Community Resilience Program, which is a cohort of 8 US cities advancing their climate preparedness efforts. Anna is also an expert resource in climate-induced migration, regional climate collaboration, and the intersection of climate and equity. She's currently researching ways in which local communities and governments can inform federal policies to address climate migration and relocation challenges. Prior to joining NLC, Anna supported the Puget Sound Climate Change Preparedness Collaborative, a cross-sector consortium dedicated to enhancing regional resilience and climate preparedness. She has a background in film, media, and foreign languages, and graduated with a master's in environmental policy for the New School for Public Engagement. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share right now, and hopefully we'll be able to spotlight Anna and Victoria for this talk we're going to have, this fireside chat for the topic.
All right. Thank you so much, Krista. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be opening this amazing conference, which I have attended twice in the past in person and really learned so much from. I just really enjoyed it, made so many connections. Unfortunately, we can't be together in person, but I think the way that this is going to, has been designed and like in terms of a community of practice and just sort of spread out over a few weeks, super excited about this model. It's very innovative. The steering committee did a fantastic job of designing that. So thanks to everybody. And first off, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm very, very grateful to work and live in Washington, D.C., which is the traditional territory of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people. And Victoria, it's such an honor. Big fan of yours. Definitely have been reading your work for a long time, and I'm so grateful to be sharing this like little stage with you. So if you'd like to say a few words to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. And likewise, I am a huge fan of yours. And I think, our conversations over the past year have really shown how incredible it is to, despite being virtual, despite all of us being in our homes, our living rooms, maybe our offices, that we can still have incredible conversations and work towards solutions and really do that together and build relationships, which I think is so important for what we're going to talk about today. Climate migration, but more generally, climate solutions. So I'm really looking forward to not seeing all of you, but hearing from you and hopefully building those connections out beyond our fireside chat into one-on-one conversations and answering some questions and really building out cooperative solutions with everyone today, but also in the months to come. And I hope that the conversation Anna and I are about to have will spark some questions, ideas, solutions in each of your living rooms or wherever you are zooming in from today.
Thank you, Victoria. So let's set the stage a little bit for folks. They're in New England. A lot of states have been experiencing, well, let's go back even a little bit. So 2020, record year for climate impacts, the pandemic, obviously, and a lot of movement, right? A lot of people moving from, California outwards, moving up to the Northeast, leaving the Northeast to the Sun Belt. There are existing trends in place. There are trends that were accelerated due to the pandemic. And folks in New England experienced this firsthand, right? A lot of towns were kind of overwhelmed overnight. So small towns that did not expect all the New Yorkers to come up, buying their second homes, using their local. There was a story about the trash. There was a whole controversy about using the local trash dump, and so there's a lot going on. And so I just want to set the stage a little bit nationally. And you've been working in this space for many years, much longer than I have, and you have a lot of really rich firsthand experience with communities. So, can you just set the stage a little bit for us in terms of, the landscape in the U.S. and what that means for New England communities?
Yeah. So maybe to do that, I'll talk a bit about my own experiences with environmental migration and my work, which really began in earnest about 5 years ago with support from National Geographic. And I had this question of what was America's climate change story and what were the impacts that needed some type of national support to ensure communities could create and then implement their own visions for living resiliently in a climate changed world. And over the course of 2 years, I had the opportunity of doing a national listening tour, of traveling across the United States and US territories, from the American Arctic to the Gulf Coast, from US territories in the South Pacific to the Northeast, to listen to how communities were being impacted by climate change in the 21st century in 2016 and 2017, and what was needed to support them. And the two big takeaways that I had from that was that climate change is really a story about losing who you are. People talked about the impacts to their houses, their school systems, their roads and bridges, but ultimately they moved past that and instead talked about how they could no longer grow tomatoes in the backyard like their grandparents did. They may have to leave a graveyard behind, leave an ancestral land behind, leave who they are behind in search of safer ground. And that brings me to the second thing, that Americans were on the move, that people from Alaska to California, from Florida to American Samoa, were being impacted by climate change past the threshold of adapting in place. They had to make the impossible decision of where to go next. Where would they move their community, their family, their neighbors, to a place that was both safe, but also still connected to their sense of identity and to those people that made them who they are. And that brings us to today. Like you said, this past year in 2020 has been a record-breaking year for disasters. The US and US territories experienced 22 $1 billion disasters. That is devastating. And each of those wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, all of them come with displacement. People who are being displaced immediately as the fire burns their home, as they are flooded out, but also making that decision of, after the 17th flood, they no longer feel safe in their community and they're looking for somewhere else to call home. And that's really the view from the Northeast. It's, yes, absolutely, these climate disasters, but also where we are experiencing lots of climate disasters in the West, in the Southeast, people making the decision, looking in the Northeast as a place that is being impacted less by climate change. And I wonder, maybe Anna, if you want to talk a bit from your point of view, looking at that national lens. What are you seeing in terms of trends of people moving, of what people are talking about in these national conversations?
Yeah, interestingly, I think there are several different sort of demographic trends happening simultaneously, which presents confusion, right? Because you're like, oh, I thought everybody was moving to California. Well, kind of turns out a lot of Californians are moving to Idaho. A ton of people are moving to the Sun Belt, but people are also leaving Miami, and real estate is starting to feel the brunt in certain areas like Bal Harbor, right? Super wealthy areas. So I think there's these sort of simultaneous trends that if you look at them, sort of like just from a bird's eye view, it appears a little bit confusing, but ultimately, the way I see this is almost in sort of the ways that cities are being impacted. And so, I work at National League of Cities. We represent 20,000 cities, towns, and villages through our state leagues. And, what we're really seeing is that there's cities that are being directly impacted and are super vulnerable, right? Like they're right in the crosshairs of wildfire territory, right in the WUI, that wildland urban interface. They're right on the coastline. They might be smaller. They're not like Miami. They don't have that sort of right, the big bucks from Miami. They just can't. They can't. They don't have the capacity to adapt like Miami can. And so there are these smaller communities really at risk of sort of losing tax base, et cetera. And then there are communities like Orlando that are experiencing their own stressors, and they are still taking people in, right? So they're growing exponentially, and then they're also taking in migrants from Puerto Rico, from coastal Florida. So there's these sort of cities that are experiencing their own stressors, and they are becoming receiving cities. And then I sort of see that there's these cities that are being touted as like climate havens and climate destinations. And, I think parts of the Northeast are starting to latch onto that narrative a little bit and thinking about, and wisely so, because, there were obviously climate impacts are going to hit everywhere. Nobody is going to escape this, but in some areas it will be less, right? And so the Northeast, Vermont, New Hampshire, some of these areas definitely are being looked to as climate havens. And so I think, there are multiple trends. That's not to say that, again, the Northeast is not going to be impacted by sea level rise. I mean, absolutely it is, but there will be sort of multiple dynamics and trends going on at the same time. So that's sort of in my mind how I see this, is like cities being impacted in many different ways. And many cities have not yet been impacted at all, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And then some cities, for example, a city in Missouri that I was working with this year, my colleague there, she's saying, oh yeah, after Harvey, we had a ton of people come up here. I was like, that's climate migration, right? I mean, the city may not say, oh, we are taking in climate migrants, right? They may not sort of know the language for this or kind of understand that, oh, that is directly that. But, and this happened post Katrina, post Harvey, like after every single event. And so I want to ask you, Victoria, a little bit about that, the sort of difference in migrants and like, the difference in, is there a difference between people who have to leave post hurricane and sea level rise, which is a slow change event, right? Or heat or drought. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that, your answer really brings to center stage that climate migration is messy and climate migration is complicated. There is no single story of how Americans are moving in a climate changed world. We all make decisions on where we choose to live for really personal reasons. Think about your own migration journeys. Maybe you went to another place for college, for education. Maybe you followed your spouse or your family to another state because that's where they were from. Maybe you moved somewhere else for a job. All of those things still exist, and climate change is layered on top of them. So when we talk about people making that impossible choice to leave where they call home, it's not just climate change that is pushing them. It could be pull factors. Maybe there's better economic opportunity elsewhere because climate change is impacting their livelihood in agriculture, or maybe they work as watermen on the Chesapeake Bay. All of these things are happening simultaneously. So decisions on how to migrate are complicated and they're personal. But we can think about people choosing to move in a climate changed world in two velocities, in two different time frames. We can think about them in slow onset disasters and sudden onset disasters. Slow onset disasters are exactly what they sound like, these slow moving impacts of climate change, things like sea level rise that will displace 13 million Americans by 2100. That is a slow moving disaster. Erosion along our coastlines, drought over the course of several years. These are slowly developing disasters. But there are also those sudden onset disasters. Those $22.1 billion events in 2020 were all sudden onset. They are things like hurricanes or inland flooding, wildfires or snowstorms. Those are sudden onset disasters. And those immediately displace people. They destroy homes, they destroy communities. And in the aftermath of that disaster, households, individuals, families, neighbors are having conversations about whether to build back in their hometown, whether they try to navigate FEMA to build back their family childhood home, or whether they move. They don't have the savings, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the mental health capacity to live in a place of such trauma. And those people are making a decision in a matter of weeks, months, a year to relocate their lives to somewhere else, a place like the Northeast that is less climate vulnerable. That's really different than people who are looking into a future where the Chesapeake Bay becomes less economically viable for watermen or for farmers that are seeing their fields be inundated or have saltwater intrusion, and are making a decision that in the next 10 years, I am going to sell my land, sell my home, and move elsewhere. The same is true for retirees, looking at where they are going to move, not because they are displaced immediately, but because they've lived through one too many fire seasons and don't want to breathe in that smoke for the next 10 years when they're trying to enjoy their retirement. Those are really different decisions than the community that is displaced by a hurricane and looking for a new home. And, I think that thinking about how people are making these decisions, not in a vacuum, I wonder, how that relates maybe you can talk about, what those demographic trends, what those national movements that you were talking about to the Sun Belt, to two places that may not be vulnerable today, but will be vulnerable in the future. How
Mhm.
does that look from your point of view, looking at this kind of national picture?
Well, I think there's huge equity implications here, right? If folks continue to retire in the South and in Arizona and areas that are high hazard, um, that's a lot of elderly people at risk, right? Um, and on the flip side, if we start to see, I think, a kind of a market-driven retreat, that's extremely dangerous for low-income communities and communities of color, elderly, anyone who's frontline. Because if the market starts to churn without your ability to sell that property and get somewhere and have those options, there's massive equity implications here. What were you seeing in Louisiana on this? Like, I know that you did some work there, and did you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, there are huge equity implications in Louisiana, but also across the country.
Mhm.
It's really important when I say that climate migration doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it also does not exist in a temporal vacuum, that all of a sudden people are being displaced in 2019, 2020, 2021. These are layered on our histories, on discriminatory histories throughout the past 250 years in the US. And that's true in Louisiana. It's also true in Alaska, where I do a lot of my work. When we think about the communities that are most immediately impacted in Louisiana, they are coastal communities. They are tribal communities that have a deep spiritual, cultural, and economic connection to the Gulf. They are Vietnamese immigrant communities. They are fisher folk who, again, have a deep connection to the heritage of the water and to economic livelihoods in the water. They are Black communities that were established in the 1860s and 1870s that have a deep connection to that soil, to that place. And we are seeing a football field of loss of land because of erosion, because of subsidence, and because not just of sea level rise, but also because of how we humans have treated the natural buffers of the coast of Louisiana, caring for our wetlands rather than cutting through them. All of this has made coastal Louisiana and communities across coastal Louisiana vulnerable to displacement. And they're being displaced inland to predominantly white communities. And in that, there's a question of equity, but there's also a need to address racism and an understanding that, yes, it is a question of how to fully support and how to fund relocation and support people making that decision to move, making sure that the sewage systems, that the schooling, that the housing is there, and also that there are spaces to build connection, to build a relationship, and to talk about those preconceived racisms and discrimination that we're seeing today. And that's a lot of the work that I am doing in Louisiana, is bringing together inland communities and coastal communities in the same room or in the same virtual room to build connections over faith, food, and music, things that people can come together around and build a pathway forward to not just having a resilient migration pathway, but being a good receiving community. And that part, the receiving community, I think is essential to everyone in this virtual room. A big question that we hope we'll talk about here, but you will talk about amongst your colleagues, is how to be the best receiving community you can be to both benefit your residents and your community, but also ensure that you're providing an inclusive place that people from the Gulf, people from the West, people who are being displaced can call home comfortably.
I think the social aspect of this is such, and cultural, it's such an sort of overlooked aspect. And I know you've written a lot about cultural heritage, and I just love that sort of storytelling aspect of, you know, it's not just about the infrastructure, it's about the social, and it's about how do communities start to blend and be welcoming. And sometimes there's a reaction in the beginning of like overwhelming, let's donate everything to these people. They're here, they're new. And then as time passes, there's this sort of like, we notice there's more traffic. Okay. There's less hospital beds. Oh, crime seems to have gone up. Do you know what I mean? So there's this sort of like, it has to be not just, let's just donate everything in the beginning, in the front end. I think there needs to be a lot of facilitated work to ensure that folks start to talk to each other. You know, I know in Orlando, they've been doing a lot of work with nonprofits there to welcome new residents. And they have like street parties, they have food, they have dancing, music, to really just warm people up and say, hey, this is a welcoming place to come. So, I love that you're bringing all of this up. So let's talk a little bit about the threats and opportunities for each community. So when we talk, let's I think keep it in the New England context, just for the folks on this webinar. How, like, what does that mean to be a receiving community, and what does that look like? Some of those long-term welcoming activities, what does that look like? And I just want to get into a little bit about the sort of the threats and things that the challenges that people should be wary of, and also the opportunities. I think wonderful things can come out of new people arriving in a community, right? Like new cultures, fusions, mixes of things. I love that, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. So maybe threats and opportunities.
Yeah, and I think a good way to frame this is what you just brought up. Two things. One, that being a receiving community is an all hands on deck process, right? It is an all hands on deck, and it is a process. It is something that everyone has a part to play in. Whether you are a government official, whether you are a planner, you're in the mayor's office, you're in the equity office, you are a school official, you're an educator, you're a nonprofit manager, no matter who you are in your community, you have a part to play in being a receiving community. And not just in the weeks after you receive households or individuals who are moving after a sudden onset disaster, but in that process, moving into a new hometown, building a community does not happen overnight. It does not happen in the short term or even the medium term. So when we're thinking about how to be a good receiving community, we have to think about, one, how do we support everyone in my community to see themselves as participants in building that welcoming place? And how are we planning proactively, not just for the day a family, the day an individual moves, but the 15 years after they have moved, so that they too become leaders in the community, that they feel supported? And I think, to do that, you have to think about three big questions. You have to think about who is moving to your community, when are they going to move, and why are they moving there? And I'm not saying that you will know the answers clearly to these three questions, but having some general ideas about those will help you make more informed decisions. So thinking about who is moving, think about what relationships your community might have to places that are seeing more disasters. Maybe there is some type of connection between your town and a town in Florida. Maybe there is some back and forth between retirees from your town moving to a place in Florida. And maybe there will be a reverse migration, which there are projections of people moving back to the Northeast. And what does that look like? You might look at where people have moved because of those low air quality, the smoke, the public health consequences of fire country, a number of which have moved to the Northeast. Again, what are the relationships between your community and how people are choosing to move in both sudden onset disasters, but also those slow onset disasters of repeat flooding, of repeat fires? And then thinking about when people are going to move. You can think about when people are moving immediately after a slow onset disaster, often in the summer and fall when hurricane and fire season are, but also thinking about those current trends that Anna was talking about, and maybe some projections we can talk about of when people are likely to be moving on a larger scale, thinking about those bigger climactic trends of sea level rise, how people are going to make choices, and start thinking about how am I planning for 2040, 2060, 2080? What does that look like for my community? And
Mhm.
finally, thinking about why those individuals are moving. Yes, because they are climate vulnerable, but also those people are people. They want to feel that they are moving to a place with economic opportunity, with educational opportunities. They want to look at a place and see cultural opportunities to engage, to be a part of something cohesive, and thinking about people holistically, not just as climate migrants, but as people is really important to think about not just the threats, but the opportunities of how to build up a good receiving community. And there will be challenges. There will be challenges to having to accommodate more people for your critical infrastructure, for getting housing rate equitably, for increasing the capacity of your education system, of your social services. And all of those, we have tools and some examples like Orlando that Anna was mentioning, that maybe she can talk a bit more about, and maybe some other examples like Holyoke that we can pull in. But we also have to think about how getting back to that cultural heritage, getting back to that social cohesion, what are the ways that you are bringing in your fellow community members, the bank manager, the educator, to create a holistic view of being a receiving community, not just investing in infrastructure. And I think, Anna probably also resonates with this as somebody who has a background in storytelling and ensuring that everyone sees themselves in the story of the solution, and providing those pathways to really engage no matter who you are in the community.
That's right. And I want to bring up, I saw a question in the chat that were in the Q&A that it was something I wanted to bring up with you as well, as that question of, you're talking about who's moving, right? So what happens when the folks moving in to the community, let's say they're, it's their second home, as I was mentioning earlier, they're significantly wealthier than the community they're moving into. And often this can even happen not just from the pandemic sort of movement, or like the slow onset disasters that you were talking about, sort of people having the time, the money, the choice, the agency to be able to leave Florida and say, or coastal North Carolina and say, oh, I'd like to move and settle in Vermont, or I'd like to settle in Massachusetts, or whatever, right? That's a privilege. But so what happens when what happens to the community when there's sort of this sudden like influx of cash? And I also heard about this happening in California, where and this is something that I didn't even think about, but folks were coming into Chico, California, really, and obviously they had gone through a tremendous amount, lost their homes and everything, but they were coming in kind of flush with cash from FEMA, and they were able to buy that, $600,000 home, 700,000, whatever. I'm not sure what the average price of homes there is there, but they were able to really kind of dominate the market, and so that caused problems, that caused tension, right? So this is something that you don't often hear about this, but I think it's worth talking about because it's very relevant for New England.
Yeah, like we mentioned earlier, climate migration is messy, and there is not one single climate migrant. There are many different types of migrants, including the wealthy household that decides to move. And that, I think, is why it is so important both to be proactive, and also to ensure that you, again, are including everyone in your community in that planning process. If you are welcoming climate migrants from the individuals who have $1 million to invest in a property, and also the household that, because of discriminatory policies of housing over the past century, they do not have any wealth accumulation. Both of those households are moving to your community. You need to have a plan that centers equity on how you are going to address it. And there is no silver bullet. There isn't a single answer that I could say, this is what you should do. But what I can say is that you need to start planning for that now, so that when you have that influx of cash that you were talking about, Anna, you can make sure that it is being used to the best of your community as a whole, and that you are still providing in-placement, right, migration pathways for those people who have less savings. And that means that maybe you need to have a half-day workshop that is visioning with different stakeholders in your community to talk about these challenges and opportunities, to have a starting point. If you have not already had that meeting, you should consider having that with stakeholders from your community, with leaders, with all government offices, to think about what comes next for making the most of people who are moving in with resources, and also being open, accessible, and inclusive to those individuals that have significantly less resources. But if you're doing all of this reactively, you are amplifying the threats and you are diminishing the opportunities. And that is something that can't wait, right? We know that climate disasters are increasing year on year. The best time to start that planning was yesterday. So thinking maybe taking a piece of paper or pulling up a virtual Post-it and start listing the people in your community that you want to get around a table to start having these conversations. So you can pose the question on a post to me of, how do we address this reality that we have people of varying resource levels choosing to move to our community? What does that mean for us? What do we have to start thinking about now? And how can we ensure that we are not going into this somewhat blind, like I think many communities did in 2020 with the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. Susie had a good question about going beyond the social and thinking about politics and economics, and she's asking about are there examples of communities being proactive in addressing the profound implications of migration for the local economy, tax, and land use decisions, both in the leaving and receiving communities? That's a big one. Do you want to take a stab at that? I have a couple thoughts about a couple communities I was thinking of, but I'd love for you to take a stab at that.
Well, maybe I will throw it back at you first, because I feel like I've talked quite a bit.
Way to punt, Victoria. Okay.
Well, I'm taking up a lot of air right now, and I'm cognizant that
Keynote. This is your process. Okay. All right. I'll say, I think to answer, Susie, your questions, this is what, as far as I know, I'm not really super well versed in as much in sort of the managed retreat process and buyouts. But I do think this is what a lot of communities are grappling with right now, is how do you manage that? There's an article by Chris Favell in the Times the other day about the Outer Banks in North Carolina. And, the question is like, do you lose your tax base? Do you just continue to adapt and like put your foot on your house on 30-40 foot stilts? I mean, what happens when you're the only one left and everything else is gone? And oh, sure, your house is still in place, but like, public services have had to kind of move away from those hazardous areas. And, I think these are the challenges we're grappling with right now. I don't think there are any like great solutions. Oh, this community packed up and left and it was super neat and tidy and they moved to, the middle of the country somewhere and they're great. No, I haven't heard of any great stories like this yet. I think this is happening in real time. And we're trying to sort of solve these questions in real time. I do think that cities, I'm hearing a lot of great sort of stories coming out of the Great Lakes cities, former legacy cities, right? Cities that lost a ton of population, sort of post-industrial migration out of those cities. And they're really thinking now about how to be sustainable, how to be resilient, how to turn empty lots into green spaces and farming, local farms. That is how you become a welcoming community, by investing in your own community, right? First, ensuring that you're sustainable and resilient and equitable, and so that you're ready when people start to come. I think the trouble is, how do you start to plan for large scale critical infrastructure projects like a water treatment plant, like Ann Arbor is thinking about right now? We don't have that crystal ball to say who's coming, when they're coming, and who they are. We don't have that. And so it's, there's projections, there's, great models out there, but it's still kind of crystal ball, right? I don't know if you want to throw out some other examples or talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that there are examples, like you said, right? Ann Arbor is one example that is thinking about how to increase its capacity of critical infrastructure, starting with wastewater management. And I think the first thing, like Anna said, is making sure that you are a resilient and sustainable community before climate migrants arrive, right? You cannot manage what you don't know. Mapping out what your current capacities are, what your limits are, and then identifying what budget you need and what technical assistance you need to grow your capacity of your critical infrastructure is your first step, right? Understanding exactly where you are in 2021, where you are going to be just with your current projections of your population and your current critical infrastructure in 2030, 2040, and 2050, and then creating those projected budgets for an additional 5,000 people, for an additional 10,000 people, for an additional 15,000 people, understanding what your capacity needs to look like and identifying what that budget needs to look like. And that's what Ann Arbor has done over the past 4 years, is thinking about what those projections might look like. So I think looking at that example is a good next step for what you might think about for your infrastructure. But I also think that, this is a moment where policy really needs to be elevated to the federal level, that we absolutely need support and leadership at the local level. And also, we absolutely need some type of federal support for those big budget items, for an acknowledgement that climate migration is not this isolated crisis, is not this isolated challenge. No matter where you live in the US and US territories, you are impacted by those $1 billion disasters, including every community in the Northeast. And that means that there needs to be mechanisms, both funding and technical assistance, but also guidance on what to do next. And while Anna and I can have this conversation, what would be even more useful is federal guidance on how to address these challenges that can source all of the best practices across all cities and counties that are trying out different things today, and what we can learn from those and ultimately build out a program, an initiative, a budget to support everyone to make those decisions. And I do wonder, Anna, if you also want to weigh in on this, because so much of your work is at the federal level, is thinking about this national picture. And also at this moment that the United States and US territories are taking climate policy seriously. This is a moment of hope. This is a moment of moving forward. What does that mean for the people on this call in receiving support, in thinking big, in understanding what their relationship is with the national government?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question. And folks right now are there's just so much energy around wow, I'm sorry to say this, but we have adults in the White House again, and we can actually get things done. And it's like we're looking back at the last 4 years of work being done at the local level. People have been busting their butts, right? Like at the local, state, regional level. I mean, doing amazing things, partnering with local communities, partnering with nonprofits, really upping their game on sort of understanding resilience and equity and all these things. And now, you know, I think the feds really want to listen, right? They're like, tell us, we are listening to you. What have you been working on? What have you been doing? And so I'm really happy to see that a lot of the policies coming out and these EOs, the executive orders, are really reflecting what people are asking for and what has been done. So yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity. Somebody just asked about the 1.9, the ARP funding. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anything yet. Look, I haven't gone through it piece by piece to know, but I haven't seen anything yet around migration on that yet. That's not to say federal funding won't probably start coming in for issues like this. I think probably right now they're trying to address the immediate needs and try to do that sort of, you know, with sustainability in mind, not like, you know, just like spending on anything. But, you know, I think there is sort of some thought into what that spending is on, but I don't think it's on migration yet, but that's not to say I don't think it will be. I do. I just think it may be later, and it may be after there is some kind of coordinating federal body to kind of you know, coordinate. Even, I mean, it sounds a little bit sci-fi, but like thinking about interstate coordination and creating incentives. You know, I know Vermont had an incentive a while ago that, darn, I just missed that year by I think I missed it by a year, but it was something like $5,000 for new residents who agreed to live there for 2 or 3 years. I mean, you know, what if like Akron, Ohio gets funding to do that and say, hey, we're Akron, we want folks to come here. We've been working on resilience. We want you to come. We want to grow our industries. You know, who knows, right? I think that is sort of beyond maybe what the levers that a city government can pull. It's a little bit like an interstate kind of coordination. I do want to acknowledge, though, that the idea of sort of a federal body or federal intervention in these issues is, you know, it could be a trigger, right? I mean, in the sense that there's been huge, like massive indignations on communities of color through eminent domain, through forced relocation, and indigenous populations. This is not something that we should take lightly, right? This idea of people need to move and people need to get out of harm's way. And, you know, I wonder if we can just like talk about that a little bit. And then there's some really great questions rolling in the Q&A. So I want to make sure we get to some of those too. But I think this is such a critical issue. And I personally feel uncomfortable sometimes when I'm talking about managed retreat and relocation, because I understand the implications that this has for certain communities. And you know, so I'm just like, I don't always know how to say these things and how to communicate this. So wonder if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. When we say that that climate migration does not exist in a vacuum, we're also talking about history. Many of the communities that are seeking relocation today were removed from their ancestral lands by the government and forcibly relocated. In Alaska and Louisiana, where I work, communities in Alaska that were semi-nomadic were forced to permanently relocate along coastlines because that was the easiest place to build a school, to get a barge of materials into a port, and build up infrastructure. That meant that the US government was forcing communities, indigenous communities, to permanently inhabit highly vulnerable coastal areas. When we think about tribal communities in Louisiana, those communities were forcibly displaced and relocated to marshlands because of the US government and because of discriminatory policies that forced Indigenous communities to the limits of this continent. When we talk about relocation, when we talk about environmental migration, it's really difficult because it must be voluntary. It cannot be forced, but it already is forced because the climate crisis is a crisis of equity, of individuals, of governments, of companies that have chose to emit greenhouse gases over the past century, none of which are the communities that are being displaced today. And with all of that, and with talking about having a federal coordination, I think who leads that really matters, right? Leadership matters. Who is leading the table, who is at that decision-making table, how participatory that process is of creating a national guideline for voluntary relocation, of prioritization of who gets funding first, who is making those decisions really matters. It has to be community-led at the federal level, right? It has to be local leaders that are elevated to federal policy-making decisions that can hold those conversations and it not be a top-down approach, but it truly being a approach that brings local voices in into the halls of federal decision-making. And so we have not yet seen this administration make those decisions about climate migration or climate adaptation. When we look at the incredible movements over the past 2 months on climate change in the White House, they have prioritized greenhouse gas mitigation, right? Ensuring that we are meeting a low carbon economy by 2035 that is absolutely essential. And that we are showing the world that we are leaders in climate change through Kerry's office. And Gina McCarthy and Secretary John Kerry are incredible leaders. But neither of them has been tasked with climate adaptation or climate migration. And so I think what comes next, where the next stimulus funding comes, there's a big question of how much will we be able to support communities adapting to be receiving communities, how we will support communities being displaced, and how are we ensuring that those are being led by community voices, by Indigenous voices, by Black voices, to center equity, not just today, but also historically.
We had some good questions in the Q&A. I just wanted to hit some of those because how annoying is it when you're on a webinar and like they don't answer any of the Q&A? You're like, oh,
so annoying.
It's so annoying. All right, let's get to the people. Okay. How do we find out who is moving to our community? Through schools, some official in the city, town, churches, temples, mosques, nonprofits? That's an interesting question because I think there is like, what I've seen is in terms of tracking where people move, where people are going at like post-disaster, it's been a lot of like private sector tracking cell phone data, or it's been like tracking like Google inquiries or queries, whatever they're called. And then there's been tracking of schools and like school enrollment. And so I think that's what they've been able to do. I think it was Hunter College did a really great report on where Puerto Ricans had moved post Irma and Maria, and they were able to sort of track like through New York State, Florida, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and where school enrollment had gone up. So I think there's different ways of knowing, but I don't know if that exactly answers the question. But what do you think, Victoria? Do you know any ways that folks can find out like who is moving into their community?
I think that you've hit on the main points. There is no, national or public sector tracking. There is lots of private data that is being used for papers. There are many different models for where people are moving. But honestly, the best data is local data. So looking at your own county, your own city, and who moved in 2020 to your city or to your county, in 2019 and 2017, a huge hurricane season. Understanding past migrations over the last 20 years locally, I think, is more context specific for developing solutions than some of these national models that are a little bit more difficult because they are on the macro level and don't really take into account the kith relationships of people moving to where they know people.
Yeah, that was a much better answer. Thanks, Victoria. Sorry, I missed this one from a while ago from the Capital Region Planning Commission. How do we combine existing policy needs and receiving that create substantive equity while also considering those displaced by climate and those migrating because of climate? Not sure I understand that question. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Maybe you can clarify what you mean. Established residents with more privilege and wealth than incoming migrants may view the newcomers as taking resources from them. How can we move folks from the zero-sum attitude of giving to others versus taking equals taking from me? Yeah, that's a great question. There are some great organizations like Welcoming America that specialize in this. And whether or not you become a Welcoming America city, like a welcoming city, which I highly recommend, even if you don't, they have a ton of resources and they online free to use. And they just came up with this document, a refreshed version. I believe they'll be releasing it soon, called the Welcoming Standard. And it's a list of it's almost like a checklist of how to become a welcoming city. It's really, really cool. I'm actually talking to them to see if we can adapt that for receiving cities so that communities in New England, communities in the Midwest, folks that are thinking about becoming, almost even marketing themselves as a climate destination can really think about, and maybe this is kind of what the folks at the Capital Region are asking about, but, thinking about housing, how do you kind of ensure that existing housing stock is affordable and that people are not going to get displaced when newcomers come in, right? And how do you sort of welcome back to this whole welcoming idea, so that's a great resource, I think, to look at. Did you want to add anything to that, Victoria?
Welcoming America is an incredible resource, and I highly encourage everyone to check out their website and the many toolkits that they have for facilitating these conversations. And I also think if you are looking for an interesting weekend read, that there have been a number of studies in the aftermath, particularly of Hurricane Katrina, to Houston, receiving community members from New Orleans, but also other communities in Louisiana that had this exact challenge. And there have been some studies of what went right, what went wrong, what the mayor could have done better, what conversations residents in Houston could have had proactively. And also we're seeing some more recent papers with Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, kind of doing a follow-up of, did those lessons come to fruition over the decade in between those two disasters? So I think that if you're interested in some peer review studies, there's also some really great resources out there to learn too.
we've got some more. Let's see. Could you speak to the process of considering migration and community planning? That's an interesting one. Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Victoria?
So I am not a planner. I want to preface that that this is outside of my area. But what I do have experience in is again that participatory visioning of community stakeholders in planning for a 20-year outlook with climate migrants. And I think a resource that individuals on this call could check out is the Climigration Network, and just typing in Climigration into Google. There have been some great community of practice learning sessions that have been recorded around this question of planning, and some useful blog posts. So I would say a resource to follow up with some planning examples to check out climigration.org.
There was a question here about ensuring that the long-term plans of the administration include climate and equity. And you know, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, to me, I feel like going to your elected officials and pressuring them and being present, if you're not, if you're just a resident, or if you're staff, like bringing these things up consistently and saying, oh, I went to this conference and I heard about this. Oh, have you read this report? Oh, this is interesting. Oh, did you hear about this story that happened in the city in New Hampshire? Like bringing these things up and just keeping them top of mind for people. You know, we do through the National League of Cities, we do advocacy days where, you know, we'll take folks to the Hill. We don't take them physically, I don't think anymore, but virtually, and it's a great day. And folks, you know, the local elected officials get to go and meet with their Congress people, and often they already know each other, and because they're the squeaky wheels, they're the ones that are pushing and saying, hey, what are you doing about climate? What are you doing about this? So I think the more residents do that, the more staff do that with each other, with interdepartmentally, you know, just keeping these issues top of mind, right? We don't want it to be a trend. I don't think it's going to be a trend because it is so in our face at this point that who can ignore it? But you know, I think there was a huge sort of what's the word, like just a huge kind of almost a boost in activity around racial equity in particular since the protests over the summer. And you know, even I've noticed it. We're having conversations in, you know, among cities that cities are talking about this when they never were before. Or at least a few of them were before, right? Like the vanguard cities or the super progressive cities. Now everyone is talking about this, and they're like, how do we do this? How do we ensure that there isn't a sort of a backlash from our white communities? I mean, these are real questions, and people are having these open discussions like, what is targeted universalism? How can I explain that to my community? So I think, you know, right now there are just really great conversations happening all over at all scales. And so I think keep that going. You know, we have to keep these issues front and center. So James has a question about the challenges and realities of migration beyond New England. And this is a great one for you, Victoria. So specifically among those who are spiritually and subsistence economically linked to place with no economic resources to relocate.
Yeah, so there are a number of communities, all communities that are seeking full relocation today in the US are Indigenous communities. They are communities in Washington State, in the state of Louisiana, and in Alaska. And with the exception of a single community in Louisiana that received a HUD grant, no community has received full funding to relocate. There have been a few communities in Alaska that have received piecemeal funding over the past 30 years to relocate a home, a school building, a road. That stop and go funding is really detrimental to wholesale planning of a community. So one of the biggest challenges is finding that funding, designating funding, which this administration could do. But again, I think it's pretty difficult to do without pairing that with guidance and prioritization, because who receives $100 million to relocate, $400 million to relocate, is a really hard decision, and a decision that needs to be based in equity, thinking about how are we supporting communities that were forcibly relocated, and what responsibility does the federal government have in that in terms of reconciliation? That's a question that hopefully we will see at least discussed in the year to come as this administration is thinking about climate change. So one, having that wholesale funding, but two, to your second question, about spiritual connection, about subsistence, about cultural heritage, both tangible assets like your archaeological sites, your connection to a spiritual landscape, and intangible heritage of dance and song that is also connected to that landscape. There is no single support mechanism, because at the end of the day, there is a limit to adaptation. There is a hard wall that you run up against where you then spill into non-economic loss, things that you cannot get back. When the ice melts along your shoreline, you cannot get that back. You can no longer ice fish. You can no longer use that to hunt seals. You can't use it to visit your family in the village over. That is lost. And so when we talk about loss and damage of climate change, of those intangibles, of those cultures, of those identities, we're really talking about how do you compensate people for things being lost that are priceless? How do you address that? And in the international landscape of climate change and policy, we're starting to have those conversations about climate loss and damage. But in the United States, in the US territories for indigenous nations that are in the current US, we haven't really had those conversations, because that brings in the difficult term climate reparations, that we know has a heavy political baggage that is brought into the halls of DC when you start talking about reparations. And I think it's a big challenge, that I don't know what the next step is going to be. I don't know that we will talk about loss and damage domestically. Maybe Anna has a more optimistic outlook, but that being said, I think this is a really important thing for receiving communities to think about, because there will be individuals that are choosing your community as a hometown that are leaving intangible pieces of themselves behind. And how do you support that? Through your local cultural institutions, through creating space for people to still practice dance and song, even if they are not in their hometown. How are you creating cultural centers for their own cultures in your libraries and your local museums? That is a really important part of being a good receiving community.
There's a really interesting question here about international migration, and I just wanted to address that. So I think there was quite a lot of work done in terms of internal displacement, right? In the international context, it's you're an international, you're just sorry guys. You're an internally displaced person, right? And that's actually what we're talking about here, right? We're not talking about people coming from Central and South America. But so I think, so this is my perspective and my opinion only. I think in the last 4 years, because of the administration and obvious limitations, and just a whole other discussion around immigration. To me, the discourse was always around internally displaced. Like, what are we going to do about kind of coastal residents and wildfire residents. Like, so that was sort of but I think this is such a really valid question because as Victoria alluded to earlier, climate migration is not the only thing that drives people to leave, right? Sometimes if there's a hurricane or that sudden onset event, but often it is wrapped up into three other things. And particularly when you're talking about the Central American context in places like Honduras or Guatemala or, Mexico, there's violence, there's, there's political pressures, there's economics, there's climate induced drought, or, like a bug can damage your whole coffee crop and really put people out of business, small farmers. So, and then, maybe on top of that, there's some, they're having family issues and they're like, okay, we're going to go. And so, I think people's first choice generally is not to move far. They're not like, oh, I want to move to Michigan. They're like, no, we're going to go like a few towns over. And then if that doesn't work, we're going to go to the next country over. And then, so it's this sort of like, it's a different scenario. I mean, I think if you put yourself in that place, you would feel the same way. Like you're not necessarily going to move to France if there's sea level rise in your community. You're going to say, well, where do I have family nearby? I'll go stay with them and I'll try to settle and find a job. Same thing. And so the question about people coming from, international, what I'm reading and what I'm hearing, and the research seems to be that it will likely be from people from Central and South America. They're already really coming in large numbers, and a lot of them are unaccompanied youth, which is just beyond shocking and saddening to me. And so, is that related to climate? Maybe, probably, depends where. But, I think that's something that we really also do need to think about, and that's going to probably affect all of the existing connections that, the cities that already have those connections in place, whether or not they're close to the border. So if New York has a large amount of Mexicans from one particular town, from Pueblo. And so there's these connections, these lines. And so, I think it will probably start to increase. And a lot of that depends on the Biden administration. So I don't want to speak too much more about that, but I do think that is a huge part of this discussion. It should be. And of course, there are even, more cultural implications when it comes to someone who doesn't speak the same language or have the same skin color or, the same religion, right? There's all these kinds of questions. And then somebody was asking about, there's another good question in here about sort of people moving into rural areas where there already isn't much housing, and folks might be a little bit racist, or there's these sort of economic struggles, and et cetera. And how do you plan for that? And Victoria, I don't know if you want to. This is sort of you've been sort of continually kind of reinforcing these ideas throughout the chat, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, so I know we only have a few minutes, but I do want to say from the last question, there was an executive order that addressed international climate migration. So I would encourage you to look back at the White House's executive orders, and that gives an indication of how this administration is thinking about international migration flows connected to climate displacement. Nothing concrete, but it gives an indication that they are thinking about that, and we might see movement internationally about those those connections to the U.S. immigration system at large. And for rural migration, again, I think this is why there is a need for federal coordination, right? For an acknowledgement that this is not just large cities receiving people migrating away from climate impacts. This is also rural communities, this is rural counties that will need additional assistance, not just additional assistance in increasing their infrastructure, their housing, which is absolutely necessary. They also need assistance in thinking about the spaces for conversation that need to happen. And we have at least a foundation for thinking about that at the federal level through something called the Resilience Dialogues that are facilitated by the US Global Change Office, the office that puts out the US National Climate Assessment. And those dialogues are opportunities for communities to work with a set of experts and a mediator to come together and identify the biggest challenges. The ones I have been a part of have addressed migration into rural counties. Almost all of the dialogues are in rural areas. And there are challenges both culturally, socially, and economically. And again, being proactive, having that space where you're bringing the people that you wrote down earlier in this keynote on your piece of paper or on your virtual post-it that you want in the room to start talking, start having those conversations now and start thinking in those conversations about what resources are needed from the rural point of view, from the peri-urban point of view, depending on where you are. All of those will be context specific. And if you're looking for additional reading after we finish up in 2 minutes, I would check out, just Google Resilience Dialogues, and you will get to the white papers that come out of each of those. And they're really good examples of what rural communities are thinking about in those discussions.
That was a great program. Is it still going on?
It was paused. I'm not sure if it is going to come back to life.
Okay.
I hope so.
Yeah, that was a great program. So I've been trying to kind of answer some more of these questions online. So hopefully I got to most of them. There's a few more, I'm sorry, but we're definitely out of time. And Victoria, I just wanted to leave us on the idea of, how important storytelling is. And I used to work in film and television. I understand this. I use it all the time. But to get complex ideas across, can you leave us with a little bit of inspiration around the power of storytelling and what that means for somebody who's like not necessarily a storyteller, but a planner or a nonprofit partner? I would love to hear a little bit about that. And then I just want to note one thing. Following this discussion, Victoria, and in kind of preparation for the discussions that will happen over the next few weeks, Victoria and I are going to work with Krista and the team to come up with some guiding questions. Nothing big, but just a couple things to think about as you're talking about housing, economics, transportation, and just to like sprinkle a little bit of climate migration in there. Okay. Victoria, please, you can take us home.
Yeah. So I think as we are at time, the one takeaway that I really want everyone to have from this fireside chat is that climate change is your story. Climate change is all of our stories. Whether you are a planner in a big city, whether you are an accountant, whether you are an educator, whether you are an artist, climate change is impacting you, and you are part of the climate change solution. At the end of the day, when we talk about the importance of storytelling as a tool for climate action, what we're really saying is you are giving every person in your community an entry point to seeing themselves in change. You are giving them the tools to visualize, to imagine how climate change is impacting their lives, is impacting your shared community, and what they can do to be part of the solution. And while we don't have time to go into the dynamics of storytelling, I will leave everyone with an invitation to get in touch. I love storytelling. I'm very engaged with it as a National Geographic explorer and supporting people in telling their stories of climate change. I would love to work with you and figure out how you can create story pathways for all of your residents, community members, colleagues to see themselves in climate solutions, because we need everyone on board.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anna and Victoria, for being with us here today. And just so everybody knows, we will have a list of all the Q&A, so we will try to get some answers to you if we didn't today. And just a quick key up too for what's happening next. For everybody who's registered, you should have been able to access our living agenda. And in that, you'll have links for your group topics on Thursday. That will happen this Thursday. We'll be in topics of housing, economy, public health, and transportation. And that will happen this Thursday and then the following Tuesday, where we'll have more speakers. After that, the next 3 meetings are going to be small group discussion, and we're going to be bringing in an equity framework that you're going to hear about in the next 2 sessions. And then also, as Anna and Victoria said, hopefully we can bring in the climate migration lens as well in those discussions and keep them part of all our conversations. We're going to be using Jamboard, so it's going to be very exciting for us to put our heads together and brainstorm those solutions to really come up with a roadmap for New England that creates an equitable New England that addresses climate migration and also community sustainability and climate resilience. So I'm very excited. But thank you again, Anna and Victoria. It was extremely informative and inspirational as well to have you with us today. And I have my email, like I said, in the chat for anyone else that has questions about the community of practice and wants to get in touch with us or has a problem getting the agenda for the next few events. And then lastly, just to let you know that the next actual keynote will be Running Grass, who's an educational and cultural theorist and environmental activist. We have the luxury and the privilege to have him on our faculty at our Antioch, Seattle campus. He is also the director of the Three Circles Center. And he's worked for many years, if you may already know, he worked for many years as the Environmental Justice Program Manager for EPA. And so his talk on April 21st, I believe, will be centered on environmental justice and reflections on that. So very exciting for that as well. So we're going to stick with our time for everybody. Thank you for joining us for the last hour and a half. And we look forward to seeing most of you this Thursday. So thank you again.